to part 14 and 15 of our series going through the Gospel according to Mark, our journey with Jesus we've been doing this year, beginning at the start of the calendar year of 2021 and now coming up through Holy Week. This series has been intended that we would keep pace so that we could conclude the story that Mark is telling right at the point where the church celebrates and retells the stories of Jesus last week, the week we call Holy Week, including the cross and the resurrection, at the same time, more or less, that we'd be doing those things in the church's life in this study at the same time. And so today, we're going to take a look at chapters 14 and 15, but in a little bit different way than we've been doing throughout this whole series. And that's because in the congregations where I serve, as well as in many congregations across the country and across the world, we've already heard completely this story, chapters 14 and 15, read in worship. In fact, for us, it was our gospel reading, both of those two chapters, the whole Passion according to Mark. Mark's retelling, we've just heard fresh in our minds, and if you aren't in a place where you got to hear those things live, our worship video for this past week included the entire retelling of chapters 14 and 15, and in the coming days, our tradition in Holy Week is to retell in a different way, with a slightly different focus, events from the last days of Jesus' life, in particular through John's Gospel and its retelling on Thursday and on Friday, and then a grand retelling of everything from the beginning at the Easter Vigil. So, because there are all those opportunities to actually hear the story right out of the horse's mouth or right from Mark's lips, so to speak, instead of exhaustively reading all those two chapters out loud, I want to ask us to spend our time here today focusing on what stands out, what makes Mark's retelling different or notable. Because again, I'm going to guess that for people who have been followers of Jesus at all for very long, or even just floating around in the wider culture, some of the major points of what happens in chapters 14 and 15 are things you may already know, but let's focus in on things that are particular to Mark's retelling, maybe nuances and details that he wants us to connect or to pick up on. So starting in the beginning of chapter 14, there's a scene where Jesus is hanging out at the house of someone named Simon the leper. Isn't that interesting? Once again, Jesus is associating with people who are the wrong crowd of people who are unclean. He's there, and a woman comes up to him and breaks open this jar. She has a very costly perfume or ointment and pours it out on Jesus' head. And this causes a stir. People respond, this money could have been given to the poor. Why didn't we do that? What's this woman doing? Where did she get the nerve? This kind of thing. Now, it's worth noting, as Mark tells this story, he's not telling the same story that other Gospels tell about a notoriously sinful woman coming and wiping Jesus' feet with her hair. That's a different story, and there's different details. So even though there are some things that might feel similar to us, let's please not conflate them. And let's not, notice nowhere does anybody name this as Mary Magdalene. So there's no identity of who this woman is. Simply, she has a sense that Jesus is about to lay down his life, or that Jesus is worth giving what she has. And Jesus interprets this event as, she's anointing my body for burial. She's doing the traditional customary burial before I die. Why? Well, another bit of foreshadowing, right? You and I know that when we get to the story of the resurrection, to the empty tomb, the women come intending to anoint Jesus' body for burial, and it's not there. This will be the only anointing Jesus' body will get. So again, let's keep in the back of our mind here. This story is odd for a couple of reasons. It just sort of, it stands out when we were on this sort of very, very sharp trajectory toward the cross, but at first it seems like, well, here's a random detour with this woman pouring out this perfume, but it's another clear signpost pointing toward, foreshadowing the resurrection scene. Jesus' body isn't going to be around to be anointed after his death, because Jesus will rise when the women come to anoint his body for burial. And when we get to the story of how Mark tells the story of the resurrection, which is a weird way he tells it, which we'll get to, let's remember, Mark has been laying clear cues that the resurrection is going to happen. Not only has Jesus been saying it, he uses this moment as looking ahead toward, this is going to be the only anointing of Jesus' body he's going to get, because he'll be risen after he dies and the women want to come. A couple of things that we want to highlight from this scene, though. One is that line that Jesus says when there's this sort of general murmuring. Why did this woman waste this perfume? This could have been sold and the money could have been given to the poor. And Jesus responds, well, you've always got the poor with you. You don't always have me. Has been used over Christian history to be a way to actually detract from caring for those who are poor, to treat it like, hey, we're always going to have the poor. You can't really do anything about it. There's always going to be poverty, so why even try? Let's move on to doing this thing for Jesus. When that's not really Jesus' point. Jesus is sort of calling out their hypocrisy. Like, really, now's the moment you're going to be upset about the poor? Really? All the time. If you were so focused about the poor, y'all could have been doing things for them all the time. You can do something for the poor anytime. You don't need an excuse. But now this woman has come and done something kind and graceful and generous, and you're punching down. You're trying to pick on her because she seems an easy target, and they're basically trolling. I mean, this is one of those things that the internet is for these days, it seems, in the age of social media. Somebody does something and someone will go, well, I don't like how you did that thing. And Jesus sort of calls it, like, if your problem is really about caring for the poor, how come you're not always caring for the poor? If that's really your problem, how about you deal with it? How about you be caring for poor people anytime, all the time, instead of just picking on this woman now? So Jesus comes to her defense in a way that sort of calls out that their professed concern for those in poverty is not really what's going on here. And then Jesus uplifts her. I mean, not only does he allow this action that she's done, which in some ways breaks a whole bunch of taboos about contact between genders, between people who are not related in a public setting, and yet Jesus not only allows it, makes it safe, she's not going to get harassed anymore, but also then goes on to say, in fact, this moment is something people are going to tell stories about. And then Jesus goes on to say, in the future, anytime the good news is told, she's going to be remembered. This moment will be told in remembrance of her. That's a stark phrase, right? Because later on, we're going to hear Jesus take bread and a cup and talk about do these things in remembrance of me. And here Jesus has uplifted this woman. Again, a reminder, all throughout the way, Jesus has had this way of lifting up the people who are otherwise written off as unimportant, have no contributions, nothing to offer, and that Jesus doesn't do it in a patronizing way. Jesus doesn't step in and say, hey lady, I need you to be the recipient of my pity so I can look good. Jesus simply lifts her up. She did a good thing by pouring out this perfume for me. She was trying to be kind, and Jesus shuts down any talk of trying to attack her in the name of we want to care for the poor. Okay, that leads us to just a couple little verses where explicitly one of Jesus' disciples looks for an opportunity where he can betray Jesus and agrees to a price. The religious people who have already been looking for an opportunity to kill Jesus, to get rid of him. Now Judas Iscariot will be a part of that. He will be a part of the conspiracy and is looking for a moment when Jesus will be out somewhere public where he'll know where he can find him, and the authorities can come and arrest Jesus. A couple things that maybe we need to say about this. Obviously, Judas is remembered as this notorious villain of the Bible and maybe of all of human history, and certainly of all storytelling in human history. But I want us to be clear here. The way the Bible tells the story of Judas, it's less like he's a cartoonish villain, like in childhood TV shows, sort of twirling his mustache, looking how he can ruin things or how he can do something terrible. And he doesn't seem to be motivated strictly by greed. Interestingly enough, the way Mark tells the story, there's no mention at all about a price. There's no 30 pieces of silver. It's just he went to find a way to betray Jesus to them. They promised to give him money, but there's no talk about a price, and there's no insistence on Judas doing this for a price. That maybe colors our understanding of what Judas thinks he's doing. We can't get into his head, but at least it seems possible, by the way Mark tells the story, that it's less like Judas is simply a greedy guy who's willing to betray Jesus, his Lord, for money, but more like Judas is disappointed in what Jesus has turned out to be. That after the very clear royal imagery of the marching into the city, Jesus has again and again and again disappointed people who wanted him to be the military leader who would take things by force. And maybe finally Judas is like, this is not what I expected. I wanted him to be a king with glory and power, to rival the empire like what I've been told and was hoping the Messiah would be. I mean, Jesus is so clearly not that. Maybe finally he's just disappointed and fine, I'll put an end to this. And I'll betray Jesus? It's hard to say, and who knows for sure all the motives that might have been going on. But I think it's important for us to see at least a part of the picture isn't reducible to simple sort of cartoonish, I'm greedy and I want money, therefore I'll trade in Jesus, but more, I don't want the kind of Messiah that Jesus has turned out to be. And if that's anywhere on target, that's a difficult thing we have to face as well. Because to be honest, we keep wrestling with wanting Jesus to be a different sort of Savior. We want someone who's strong and tough and powerful and will destroy his enemies rather than someone who dies for them and who dies for us. But that's all Jesus has been offering, a different kind of power, a different picture of the reign of God. But it's not one new empire to replace the Roman Empire. That leads us into the scenes surrounding the actual celebration of the Passover that Jesus has with his disciples. There's an interesting scene leading up to it where they're clearly in the city. Everybody knows it's time to get ready for the Passover. Jesus doesn't own a house in Jerusalem. How are they going to celebrate it? The disciples go, Jesus, did you think about this? Where are we going to celebrate, the most important holiday of our lives, of our culture? And Jesus just sort of cryptically says, go into town. You'll see a guy carrying a water jar. Follow where he goes and ask that guy, can I borrow your upper room? It's interesting to me how again and again and again, Jesus has no problem and doesn't have any shame at all about just borrowing things from people. The donkey, as he rides into town, now just, can I borrow your empty room? He even borrows a grave after all, right? But interesting how Jesus, who has no material wealth or possessions of his own, just sort of has some sense. I bet that guy will let us use his upper room, his guest room. So the disciples gather, they celebrate the Passover. This is a piece for us to pause for a moment and consider the Jewishness of Jesus. Obviously, Christianity, a separate religion, our faith that we belong to, is a separate entity. But Jesus is inescapably Jewish, and that important piece of who he is an important way of understanding what's happening in this part of the story, right? That when Jesus celebrates Passover, this would have been part of his and all of his disciples' tradition every year of their lives. This is what you do. Every year at this time, you celebrate the meal. You retell the story of God setting the enslaved Hebrews free from the clutches of Pharaoh, bringing them through the Red Sea, all the plagues that strike down Pharaoh and take him down a few pegs, and how God saves and redeems the people, and how the lamb's blood on the doorpost keeps the people safe, and God passes over those houses. All that storytelling is a part of the Passover celebration. And so when Jesus is celebrating Passover, all those stories are hanging there in the air. And so there would have been bread on the table, cups of wine, including some that had come to take on a symbolic meaning, one that was left for Elijah when Elijah would come back, to sort of echo back that earlier conversation in Mark's gospel about will Elijah come back, or did he already come back? They would have just eaten lamb, right? So all these things are a part of the table spread. And when the meal is over, Jesus takes the leftovers. I mean, just that by itself is significant. That instead of like starting from scratch and Jesus going out and buying a whole new menu or making a whole new thing, Jesus takes what's left over, what's now broken, right? The leftover pieces, what's broken, and takes the bread and blesses the bread and breaks the bread and gives the bread to his disciples in a way that certainly calls to mind for us who've been reading through Mark. This is what he did back when he fed all those 5,000 people. And wait a second, this is what he did when he fed those 4,000 people. That pattern, Jesus takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, gives the bread. Again, it's not all that unusual. That is kind of what you do with bread. But Mark has been calling attention to that pattern a couple of times, and now here it comes back again. Jesus takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, gives the bread to his disciples in a way that suggests that this isn't just a connecting point back to the Passover, but in a sense gathers up all those times Jesus assembled people at tables and brought the reign of God, brought the feast that is the kingdom of God into reality. Jesus now takes this bread and says, yeah, I know all your lives long you've been told, eat this bread to remember the story of Passover, to remember how our ancestors were set free from slavery under Pharaoh. But now I'm telling you, this is my body. He takes the cup, right? The Elijah's cup. This is the cup that's left over. Nobody has drunk it because nobody's Elijah, right? So Jesus takes the cup that's now left over, presumably the one left for Elijah if he comes to the table, and now says, I know all your lives you've been drinking this wine as a part of Passover, as a celebration of the sweetness of getting brought into the promised land. But now I'm telling you Drink this. This is the blood of a new covenant I'm making with you, that God is making with you through me, through my blood. No longer animal sacrifice. No Passover lamb has to die anymore. I will be that. Now, Christians who are familiar with this now as what we call the sacrament of Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, these words aren't surprising or shocking to us. But imagine what it means to be a Jewish person and to be told for thousands of years our ancestors did this thing. They ate this food this particular way and it had this particular meaning. And now Jesus just sort of walks in and says, I know that's what you think, but I'm telling you it means a new thing now. Who has the authority? Who has the chutzpah to do something like that? Like, could you imagine if I walked into your house on Christmas and I said, I see you got a Christmas tree up there. Well, I know you used to celebrate the Christmas tree as a symbol of Jesus' birth. I'm telling you now it's a symbol of I walked into your house and I'm visiting. Like, that's scandalous. I'm not allowed to do that. Christmas isn't about me. If we're all celebrating the 4th of July together and there's fireworks and I walk up to you and say, I know you've been celebrating the 4th of July and these fireworks reminded you of your independence and the wars we fought and how we were freed from British rule, but I'm telling you now the fireworks are supposed to mean I've come to visit you. Isn't that great? And now remember me. You would be shocked at my hubris for suggesting something like that, taking a story and the symbols that go with it and reappropriating them to myself. Who gets to do something like that? In a sense, this is as bald a claim of Jesus' divine authority as when he speaks to the wind and waves and they obey him, or says to somebody, your sins are forgiven, and take up your mat and go. When Jesus takes the elements of the Passover meal and says, this is now about me, nobody does it. No other rabbi floating around in first century Judaism felt they had the authority or would have dared to completely reinvent and recenter the Passover on themselves. Jesus then isn't just saying, hey, I'm a neat rabbi with some interesting thoughts about God. Jesus is doing the kind of thing that only God's allowed to do, messing with and reorienting the most central and holy feast and celebration of Israel's life every year and their faith. That's a big deal. Now, that leads then to a scene where they head out to a garden. The text says, after they'd sung the hymn, then they go out and depart to the Mount of Olives, where there's a garden outside. After they'd sung the hymn, and that's part of the traditional Passover Seder, what we might call today the Seder ritual, right? After the meal, you sing a psalm, and then what are we going to do now? Well, Jesus goes out to this garden place, which apparently is a place he's familiar with and the other disciples had known as well. And apparently also Judas is aware of the location and the plan that they're going to go there. Along the way, Jesus has told Peter that not only will one of the disciples betray him, but that he, in fact, will deny even knowing Jesus. There at the table, Jesus tells them all, I'm aware one of you is going to betray me. And then they're all like, well, who's it going to be? And of course, Simon Peter blurts out, well, I'll never let that happen. It'll surely never be me. I'll be with you till the bitter end. Peter, who, as we've seen throughout the whole series, throughout Mark's gospel, he's always one to have the right answer, to blurt out something, and then we discover, well, he doesn't, maybe his talk is bigger than his walk. And so Jesus comes back to him and says, Peter, I know you mean well, but no, even tonight, before the end of the night, before the rooster crows 2 times, you'll deny you even know me. That sets up a scene in just a little bit where that actually comes to pass. And then out in the garden, there's this sort of back and forth where Jesus takes his disciples, and then that sort of subset, those important sort of inner circle, Peter and James and John go with him, get a little bit farther into the garden, where Jesus has this time of just deep agony. And in a series of repeated scenes, Jesus goes and prays, comes back, finds his disciples have fallen asleep. He's upset that they can't even stay awake with him and keep watch. And then he goes back and does this again. And the recurring theme throughout all these moments of prayer is this tension between Jesus, who doesn't want to die and doesn't want to have to go through what the next few hours are going to involve, and yet also his willingness to continue on the course he has begun. In a sense, the whole story of Jesus has been the moment-by-moment choice. Will I continue to be this kind of Messiah? It would be so much easier and more popular by any means to be the kind of Messiah the world expects, to be another emperor, to be another king who uses armies and military strength and wealth and power and overt coercion to get your way, to force God's reign to happen. But that's the opposite of how God's reign works. So Jesus has to, again, in this moment, no, I'm not going to do that. No, I refuse that, even though it certainly would have been tempting. That also gets at the tension of how we talk about, did Jesus have to die? I mean, in a sense, the story is we've been leading toward this from the very beginning. That Jesus is the one who goes to a cross. There was no plan B. There's no alternative way where Jesus just, writes a bestseller and lives a comfortable life into retirement. Jesus seems to have been well aware that this has always been headed toward some kind of a climax that looks like a cross. And yet there's also something profoundly tragic that it didn't have to be this way. That it's a profound, terrible thing that human beings' response to the very Messiah of God is that we kill him rather than to let him reign, rather than that we recognize who he is. And that's, of course, been part of the tension of Mark's gospel from the beginning, is that when we are given the very Son of God, our response from the people who are the most well-respected religious people to the political authorities and most of the people in between, we reject this Jesus rather than realizing who he is. That ongoing question, who gets it, who sees Jesus? Most of the people look at Jesus and go, I don't want anything to do with this guy, especially if he's headed to a cross. We have to hold together then the idea that in some sense, Jesus sees his reason for coming involves the way of life that leads to a cross. He can say back a couple of chapters ago, Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's an intentional act, and yet at the same time is a profound and horrible tragedy that this happened. And it shouldn't have. It was unjust in that regard. That in a sense, you could say, like a Lutheran pastor on the West Coast, Lenny Duncan, says, Jesus didn't have to die in the same way that Emmett Till didn't have to die, right? So that when some black boy in the 1960s, 1950s was brutally murdered and killed, that shouldn't have happened. That was a terrible tragedy. That was an injustice, and it was terrible and awful and unjust. And yet, in the situation, when you put violent racism and some innocent black boy in the midst of it, you know something terrible like that is going to happen. It feels just like a powder keg is waiting to go off. In a sense, Jesus enters the world that is violent and is looking for reasons to kill messiahs, is looking for reasons to kill Jesus, and in some sense it feels inevitable in that way. But we have to hold that tension together, that there's both it didn't have to be this way, and yet also this, but I've come to be the ransom. Both happen at the same time. And then that's at the heart of Jesus' prayer. If it be your will, I'll do this. But if there's any other way, God, if there's any other way, Abba, Father, please let this cup pass from me, is Jesus' prayer. There's a weird little detail at the end of the scene in the garden as the authorities finally come to arrest Jesus. And Jesus responds saying, first off, he says, why have you come for me now, right? Because I've been out in public in the temple and teaching over all these last several days, and now you come and find me in the darkness and the cover of night, and now you come with this armed party of weapons and swords and clubs, and why now? In a sense, Jesus is calling out the cowardice of the respectable religious people who are looking for a way to get rid of Jesus when there won't be blowback for them. If this happens under cover of night, nobody knows what's going on, and nobody can be upset at the religious authorities. It just happened while we were all sleeping, and then Jesus just sort of disappears. But Jesus sort of calls out their cowardice and also shows an alternative picture of what bravery looks like. That Jesus knows how this is going to unfold, and yet Jesus steps into it. Jesus is willing to face it. A reminder that genuine courage isn't an absence of fear or apprehension, but a willingness to do the difficult thing even when you are afraid. So Jesus, not a fan of dying, not a fan of being tortured, isn't happy saying, oh boy, I can't wait to suffer, but knows this is the difficult thing he's called to do and does it anyway, and does it with an intentional, unarmed posture. Jesus goes, no weapons, no plan of resistance, no plan of I'm going to fight for my rights, none of that. Instead, Jesus knows they're going to come because they're loaded with fear, and their assumption is we need to bring weapons. But Jesus sort of exposes the difference between the way of life he's brought, the reign of God, which faces courageously danger, but without, I need to kill you back, or I need to fight for my rights. And instead, here's the cowardly, respectable religious people armed with temple police who come and take Jesus to police headquarters where they can beat him up. The reign of God and the powers of the world are in sharp contrast here and through the rest of the scene of Jesus' trial. And then there's this weird little coda where Mark, the narrator, says, also, there was a young man who was there in the commotion, and he was there, and he was just wearing a linen cloth, and he started running away when all this went down, and they grabbed him by the linen cloth, but he left the linen cloth behind, and he runs away naked. This is weird because, number one, it's just... it feels random, right? Mark is the only one who tells a little detail like this, and we're left kind of wondering, what's this all about, right? Is there some deeper meaning to this? Is this just a random detail? And it's hard to pin that down, honestly. There are some scholars who will take this as Mark clearly sees important meaning in this, and we got to figure out what it is. And maybe it's... that the word for the young man who's there is a word that shows up later in the resurrection scene, that there's a young man at the tomb. Mark doesn't say angel there, he says a young man, that maybe Mark is trying to make some sort of a connecting point, that this story is incomplete and we're going to need to get the end point at the resurrection when another young man shows up and Jesus' clothes are there, left there in the tomb. That's a possibility. Others maybe make a suggestion. This is like an echo back to Eden, right, where in a garden somebody discovers their nakedness and runs away and tries to hide. A possibility. Some have suggested that the idea of Jesus as the new Adam sort of is going to have echoes back of the garden story from Genesis 2. Others think that this was John Mark himself, that this is his cameo, that he had been there and at that point wasn't ready to follow Jesus but had been in the crowd, and he was in fact the young man who ran away naked. There's no other reason to believe that explicitly other than that Mark's the only one who tells this, and we have reason to believe later from the book of Acts that Mark had been floating around in the early Christian circles because he's a relation of another early church leader named Barnabas. But again, it's really hard to tell. It's also just possible that this is part of the story that got handed on to Mark, and he's just telling what he heard, right? Mark, from time to time, will include details that seem extraneous, even extraneous to other gospel writers. So, it was Mark who said Jesus made the disciples have the people sit down on the green grass, the feeding of the 5,000, again, in groups of 50s and 100s, and other gospel writers just say, I don't need to tell you how many people are in the groups, and I don't need to tell you the grass is green. They just cut to the chase. So this could just be an extraneous detail. It's hard to tell because there are other times we've seen where Mark will sort of leave a detail there and just assume that we'll put two and two together or get what he's trying to show us rather than tell us. But other gospel writers do that kind of thing more heavy-handedly. When John's gospel will drop one of those moments, he'll give an aside and say, this happened in order to fulfill, or this was going to indicate what would happen later on. Mark just sort of leaves details out there for us to get. And it's hard to know what's he thinking in this moment, but it's at least worth considering all those possibilities. So now, finally, Jesus is brought under what sort of first looks like a trial, and this is in front of the religious leaders' council. This would have been, again, sort of like these are not exactly civil leaders. They have kind of a local leadership kind of a rule, but all with the official imprimatur or okay from Rome. And the accusations that the religious leaders bring against Jesus are primarily theological, right? They accuse Jesus about, this guy said that he was going to destroy the temple. We talked before about how central the temple and its presence was to ancient Judaism's understanding of how we relate to God, and an attack on the temple sure looks like you're trying to destroy your faith or cancel God or something like that. That's a dangerous thing. It's like, again, trying to reinvent all of what your faith or your whole national and cultural identity is. That's dangerous, subversive kind of stuff. So the religious people, the charges they focus on against Jesus are, this guy said he was going to destroy the temple. This guy's talking and speaking like someone who thinks he's the Messiah. And then they finally come and ask him just full out, hey, are you the Messiah? And Jesus, here with the respectable religious people, his answer is the clearest it will be in Mark's gospel. He says, I am. And you'll see the Son of Man coming with clouds and power and great glory. That's important. Again, like we've seen, Jesus will identify or accept that title Messiah and then immediately shift to Son of Man, sort of his way of, because the moment I say Messiah, you've got preconceived notions, so he just sort of shifts it over into this conversation about the Son of Man. And yet, clearly he says to them, the thing you're looking for, Messiah, okay, yes, that's the thing I am, even if we don't agree on what that word means, but yeah, that's what I am. While this is all happening, while Jesus is on trial alone, right, none of his followers got to go in with him into the trial scene, Simon Peter, standing outside, and at least he's come that close. He's out there in the courtyard, but he's warming himself by a fire with the other people who have been a part of this angry mob, trying to blend in, trying maybe to find out what's going on, but also keeping a low profile. And when they start asking him, "Hey, weren't you with Jesus?" Peter, he's afraid, right? I don't know what to do, and he just sort of panics and goes, "No, I'm not one of them." And clearly he's talking with an accent. They can say, "You're a Galilean, I can hear by the way you talk. You must be one of his disciples." And again, he denies it 3 times. Peter denies that he knows Jesus, and the rooster crows 2 times there, and what do you know, exactly what Jesus has said would happen. It's worth noting that Jesus here, with the religious trial that happens, addresses not only charges about the temple and about being the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, which is what Mark has been saying about Jesus from the beginning, from verse 1. This is the story of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. So now we finally get the question. Jesus answers with an affirmative, and Jesus sort of knows that these people speak that language. Those are the categories that would be helpful or that they would think in. When now the scene shifts, as we turn to chapter 15, Jesus is now brought in front of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and the empire sees Jesus as a different kind of threat. The empire doesn't care about temples or religion or things like that. They care about political threats. And so the question that gets brought to Jesus in the next section isn't, are you the guy who's talking bad about our temple, or are you the Messiah? The question becomes, are you the king of the Jews? Let's take a look in chapter 15. So chapter 15 begins with Jesus now in front of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who again is a representative of the empire. The trial that had happened earlier with the religious leaders, their concern is Jesus has blasphemed. Jesus has claimed things about God or God's authority for himself that can't be true if he's not the Messiah. And that's the driving question. Is this guy who just looks like a homeless barefoot rabbi, could he be the Messiah? That sounds wrong. That doesn't meet with our expectations. So he can't be the Messiah, and therefore he's not allowed to say the things he's saying about God. Pilate and the Roman Empire doesn't particularly care about those religious things, but they do see a political threat when they hear people talking about an anointed, promised coming king. So the question that gets brought to Jesus with Pilate's trial is, are you the king of the Jews? This is like a misunderstanding, again, about what does it mean to be Messiah. Pilate and the empire is only concerned about, are there going to be more military or political threats we have to tamp down and squash? And Jesus, has to say back, well, that's your language. That doesn't make sense. That you're misunderstanding it. So Jesus responds when Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus' answer isn't a dodge when he says, "You say so." It's like that. Your question is a nonsense question. C.S. Lewis famously said, a lot of our questions to God are nonsensical because they have misunderstood premises. Like if we ask, "Is yellow round or square?" That's a nonsense question, right? You can't answer that kind of a question. Or I was talking with my son the other day, and he was talking about being a pastor in a church, and he said, "Yeah, because Dad, you're like the boss of the church, right?" And I told him, "No, I know it looks like that. You're misunderstanding. The role of a pastor is not to be the boss of the church. If anything, pastor is supposed to be like the servant leader, not a boss, right? Not dictating a servant." And again, like in a kid's mind, pastor equals boss of church. It's kind of like Pilate's question. Are you the boss? Are you the king of the Jews, right? So Jesus' answer isn't so much a denial as it is your question is wrong-headed, and I can't meaningfully answer your question without further confusing you. That leads now to Pilate. Even though it seems like Pilate doesn't think Jesus has done something worthy of death, Pilate is willing to still, because it's expedient, because it's politically expedient to get rid of Jesus. This is, I think, a reminder too. It's not that Pilate or the Roman Empire is off the hook for the death of Jesus, but that they are so callous and don't care about justice, they're willing to kill him anyway because it's expedient and it will be popular. It will be the less unpopular choice than freeing Barabbas instead, right? So there's that scene where there's a couple of political prisoners. Pontius Pilate says, you know what, I'll tell you what, I'll release one of them. Should I release this Jesus? You're all calling him the king of the Jews. Should I release him for you? And they cry out, no, not this man, but Barabbas. So even though Pilate knows Jesus has not done something worthy of death, certainly not worthy of death as far as Rome is concerned, he doesn't speak up and say, well, sorry, he hasn't broken any Roman laws, so he's free to go. And he doesn't do anything actually to protect Jesus as someone who's innocent. He writes Jesus up because it's easier. Pilate's complicit in Jesus' death, as much as he might want to wash his hands in another gospel's retelling. You can't do that, right? Complicity means he also bears guilt. This is an important point to make because there have been times in the last 2,000 years of Christian history where Christians have kind of given Rome a pass and said, look, Pilate was bending over backwards trying to let Jesus go. He realized he didn't do anything wrong. He's trying to help. He's the Roman authority here. He could have stopped this if he was so concerned about defending justice or protecting somebody who is convinced was innocent. And he doesn't because he's not really interested in justice because empires never are. He's interested in holding on to his power. The empire is interested in holding on to its power. And again, a sharp contrast with the way that the reign of God, the kingdom of God works, where it's all about justice and mercy and goodness for all, rather than we just need to hold on to our power. Who cares who gets crushed along the way, or who cares who is the collateral damage? Rome is definitely on the hook, and this moment is also damning for the way and thinking of the empire in this scene. So we don't get to let Pontius Pilate off the hook. The religious leaders are a part of it, the people are a part of it, and so is Pontius Pilate. Now, when Pilate finally gives Jesus over to be crucified, the soldiers do what soldiers do in a scene like this. Right? They understand their job isn't just to prosecute criminals. These people who are like the soldiers, but they're also, because they're the occupying military force, they're like the local police as well. Their job isn't to promote justice so much as to keep things orderly, and that means squelching any possible thought about anybody else stepping out of line or causing a trouble or causing a stir. So the goal of what happens when they torture Jesus, when they mock him, they strip him, and they beat him and all this, it's not just to punish Jesus, it's also sending a message to anybody else watching. This is what we do to troublemakers. That's the whole logic of crucifixion itself. It's meant to be a public and shameful death that everybody else watches, because the empire's goal is not really justice must be served, we must stop evil from happening, but more like we got to make everybody else afraid. So if we can intimidate everybody else into not doing things we don't want them to do by showing them the terrible things we will do to them, I mean, this is how the mafia works, right? This is sheer brute power and coercion. Let's not pretend this is about justice. The disciples, the soldiers, are doing what the powers of empire always do, flexing their muscle in order to make everybody else intimidated. Then, as Jesus is being led out to be crucified, there's this interesting little detail where they make somebody else in the crowd carry the cross. Again, it's an intimidation tactic. It's sort of a reminder, hey, any of you could be rounded up if we decide you're trouble. You got to carry this guy's cross. But also Mark has this interesting side detail. He says, you know who they got to carry the cross? It was Simon from Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And we, 2,000 years later, go to, who are Alexander and Rufus? But it's a reminder to me that the early church must have known who these people were, and that these are real historical figures. This isn't just a fable or an imaginary story that we made up, but that this is grounded in somebody actually knew Alexander and Rufus, and it made a difference to them. Oh yeah, it was their dad. He was the one who carried the cross. People who had known the people in these stories were part of that early Christian community. And that makes all the difference, that our faith as Christians isn't just in an interesting story that we would wish would be true, but it's grounded in people who actually knew Jesus and the people who were in these moments. Once Jesus is crucified, there's a couple of things that are central to Mark's telling that I want us to spend a minute on. One is Mark, and the other gospel writers as well, note that Jesus is crucified with two other bandits. Again, it's a reminder, Rome crucified lots of people all the time for lots of crimes. So Jesus happens to be crucified on this day with two other people, one on his right and one on his left, right? This echo of that conversation earlier where James and John want the spots of honor at Jesus' right hand and left hand, and Jesus goes, you don't know what you're asking. Here's Mark sort of pointing again at there's two different ways of seeing the world. James and John are like, we want glory and power for ourselves, and Jesus goes, that's not what I've come for. The spots at my right and my left hand are crosses. To be a part of my movement is this way of surrender, not of comfort and glory and power and privilege. Then the charge that's put up on the cross for Jesus. The Romans, will put up on a sign above your head what you're being crucified for. Again, the idea is, how do we keep everybody else from, stepping on a line? Be careful, this will happen to you. Don't do what this guy did. And the charge against Jesus, the King of the Jews. Notice again, it echoes what the trial with Pilate. They're concerned with the political charge. This guy claimed to be the king of the Jews. They don't care about the temple business. But the charge, king of the Jews, is meant not only to mock Jesus, say, look at this poor guy, he called himself king of the Jews, look what we did to him. But also it's a way of subjugating and intimidating all the other Jewish people as well. Say, look what we did to your king. We're going to do it to you if you step out of line too. It's one more way the empire is meant to intimidate people. The same way throughout human history, any attempt by the powerful to intimidate the people they're stepping on. It's what lynching was all about in the United States, and in particular the American South. Right? The idea was not just we'll find somebody, African American, a black person who is of notable stature in the community that we don't like, who stepped out of line, who dare to open his own business or something. We're not just trying to punish him and stop him from doing something we don't like. We want to make all the black community be upset and live in fear. So a lynching was meant to strike fear and intimidate and mock and humiliate everybody in that whole community. The charge against Jesus, King of the Jews, is meant to do that same thing. That Jesus crucified on the cross has a lot more in common with the victims of lynching in the United States than maybe we've thought about before. When Jesus dies, two important details that Mark is quick to highlight. One is when Jesus dies, he notes the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Short version of this. In the temple in Jerusalem, so this is not immediately nearby, but in the city, right? Jesus crucified outside the city gates, there inside the city, in the temple. How does Mark know it happened at the same time? This is just how the story goes. There is this innermost holy of holies place where God is symbolically supposed to dwell, and separating the holy of holies from the just slightly outside around it pretty holy place is this curtain that is meant to kind of symbolize the boundary between God and humanity. In fact, there are some reports that woven into its tapestry where the stars in the heavens, this sort of symbolic distance of God is far, far beyond us, removed and distant and holy and other and different from us, and there is this boundary between God and humanity. So in the act of tearing the temple curtain, again, not like Jesus steps in and tears it, but it tears on its own, Mark says. There's lots of meaning maybe loaded into that. One is this image Christians have latched onto, that the boundary between God and humanity is now dealt with once and for all. It is now parted and can't be fixed again. And it's from top to bottom, that is to say, from God's side of the equation. It's not us climbing up to God. That always ends in Towers of Babel and danger for us. But from God's side, I'm breaking that boundary. I'm demolishing the wall that had separated us. And also, it's sort of a symbolic, again, destruction of the old temple as the way that we relate to God. We've been dealing with that throughout the whole of Mark's gospel, too. And then last, in the scene of Jesus' death, I want to call attention to a scene with the centurion, the very person responsible for overseeing Jesus' death, right? So he qualifies as outsider, Gentile, foreigner, and enemy, right? And personal enemy of Jesus. Not just he's part of the Romans and we in general don't like Romans. He's the guy whose job and power would have been to spare Jesus if he had wanted to, but also he's the one who has the power to kill Jesus, who oversaw the death of Jesus. This guy watches how Jesus dies, that cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? And his response, this was the Son of God. You've been keeping track, right, all along this whole series about who are the people who recognize who Jesus is. The last one on the list is this person, the centurion, the enemy, the outsider, the foreigner, all the reasons this guy shouldn't get it. And as he watches the way Jesus dies, he says, truly, this was God's Son. That's important, right? And also for Mark, sort of says, like, look what Jesus has been doing. Always expanding. The people you don't think belong, the people you don't think will get it, they're the ones who get it. The respectable religious people, the politically powerful people, they don't get it. But look at this outsider. Look at this Gentile enemy person. He gets it. And the way he gets it isn't a miracle or some decree of Jesus or glory or light from heaven. It's the way Jesus dies. And finally, we get a scene of the burial of Jesus. And we're introduced to a guy named Joseph of Arimathea, who was apparently a member of that same Jewish council that maybe had been a part of the trial earlier in the last chapter. But also, Mark says, had been expectantly waiting for the kingdom of God. So the thing that Jesus had been saying is coming, this guy had been wanting the kingdom of God, the reign of God to happen, and maybe that's what had intrigued him about Jesus, even though he's not been willing to go far enough to commit himself as a follower, or he's keeping it kind of secret. He's sympathetic. He's an ally, at least, and wants to get the body of Jesus, which also then sets up a scene to confirm Jesus is really dead, right? When Joseph asks for the body of Jesus, that sets into motion. Pilate then goes and confirms, talks to the soldiers. Is he really dead? Yes, he's really dead. We know it. We're certain about that. That's important because a resurrection isn't a resurrection unless someone has actually died. The story of Jesus is not Jesus almost dies and then gets better on his own. Death to resurrection is the heart of this story and the heart of our faith. Again, that's important because when we get to the way Mark tells the resurrection story, which is weird, it's important to see. Mark has been setting, laying the steps for us. Indeed, Jesus really actually died so that nothing short of actual resurrection is going to be necessary for this story to end rightly the way Jesus has been announcing that it would and foreshadowing it. Also then, the women who are named, who had been there watching this all happen, Mark makes a really important point that they had seen the tomb, they watch it all happen, they know which tomb. That short circuits any protest. Well, maybe the women were confused when they went to the tomb and found it empty. Maybe they went to the wrong one. Maybe Jesus wasn't really dead. Mark probably has heard all those rumors, all those other, counter conspiracy theories, and Mark is shooting him down right here. No, actually dead. Pilate checked. Nope, the women knew where the tomb was. They saw it happen. They saw him buried. They knew where to go. And it was just 2 days later then they show up on what we call Easter Sunday. There's this pause here in the storytelling of Mark's gospel that is what we sometimes call Holy Saturday. Nothing happens because it's Sabbath day, right? And even though Mark doesn't give us a play-by-play of what happens on that day of rest, it's important to notice the timing. The day of rest, the Sabbath day, is the end of the week in the Jewish calendar, right? Each week ends with Sabbath, the day of rest. We worked and now there's rest, that rhythm that goes back to creation. And that suggests we are at the end of a week, the same week that God creates. And then the start of a new day, when we get to the first day of the week, what we call Easter Sunday, is the beginning of a whole new week, maybe even a whole new creation. For lo these many centuries, Christians have been making that connection and saying the resurrection of Jesus on the first day of the week, that's a detail not to miss. That's not just random. That's a hint that God's beginning a whole new creation, that Easter Sunday then is the 8th day of a 7-day week. But we have to get to that point of rest here first. That's been a whirlwind, I know, through chapters 14 and 15. Next week, the week following Easter Sunday, we will be having one final session to take a look at Mark chapter 16 and the strange way that it ends and the history of the variations we've got in our Bibles about it. We're going to talk about all the other questions maybe that have been lingering in our minds over chapters 14 and 15, but we invite you to join us for next week's study, next week's conversation we'll also do on Zoom. And in the rest of this Holy Week, you're invited to participate in the story in our Holy Week services on Thursday, Friday, on Holy Saturday, and of course on Easter Sunday too. Thanks for being with us here on this journey with Jesus.